Today marks the 400th day since the war in Ukraine started, though no foreign nations, including the U.S., have joined the fight with boots on the ground. Now, in his latest piece, retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis makes the case that the U.S. has delivered a severe economic blow to Russia and that it has succeeded in weakening the Kremlin.
Here to explain why the U.S. would be wise to help put an end to the Ukraine war is Colonel Davis himself. Welcome, Colonel. Thank you so much for joining us and for your service.
Thank you.
So you mentioned while we were getting ready to start recording that this was a scary piece to write. Why don't you tell us why?
Yeah, because as I really kind of detail throughout this, is that the West is kind of approaching this as they have just been mentally for the last 30 years, where they just could do virtually anything they wanted to on either the economic or the physical battlefield, and not have to worry about any kind of response, whether that was Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, Iran, or well, maybe not North Korea, but certainly most of these others that we have, Gaddafi, where they literally could do nothing in response. Whether we fire airstrikes into their countries, whether we have troops in their countries, they can't do anything about it. Russia is not like that. So the idea that we're seeking for the physical military defeat of Russia and driving them out of Ukraine, that's not an attainable military mission, because unlike all of those other foes, Putin has nuclear weapons, the largest stockpile on the planet that could wipe out our country if in a worst case scenario. And the fact that that doesn't play strongly in our setting of objectives is troubling to me, because that's how you stumble into bad mistakes.
Lieutenant Colonel, when we've chatted previously, you have warned that we will eventually get to a place where even if we're sending weapons, even if we're sending supplies to the Ukrainian troops on the ground, there will be a point where they don't have, because they're dying. Both sides are losing a lot of people, but Russia has a lot more to lose. We'll get to the point where even if we're equipping them, arming them still, there aren't going to be the people to pick up the guns, because we will have had the result where a lot of the able-bodied Ukrainians are injured or killed. Is that still looming on the horizon?
Right, and we're getting closer to that day, and now then you're starting to see that actually talked about more in the Western press. Both the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post in the last week or so have run stories specifically about how difficult it is for Ukraine to even mobilize any further people, even to recruit people or to take them off the streets and force them into uniform. They're just running out of men already. And, and the fact that the Ukraine hasn't launched any of these counterattacks yet that have been being talked about literally for months could be an evidence that they realize that they probably have one last big shot left in terms of their troops, because they have somewhere around 80,000 people that are filled with lots of Western weapons. A lot of them have been trained in NATO countries. And the problem is that once that thing is launched, that's probably the last they'll have for a half year or maybe even more. And they might not even be able to generate that much power again, meaning that if you launch an attack and it doesn't work, now then you're vulnerable to a large Russian counterattack, and there's still more than 100,000 Russian troops that have not yet been engaged in the war that are just poised just outside of the contact zone, and they could come across any time. And if Ukraine doesn't have enough men, it truly doesn't matter how many Challenger or Abrams tanks that you send in or F-16 fighters. If there's not enough men to use them, it won't matter on the battlefield.
This piece is so clear-eyed. I just want to read a paragraph from it. I really encourage everybody watching this to go and read the whole thing. You write, today, both sides and their allies have a desire to win. Both sides fight tenaciously. Both populations believe they are in the moral right, and neither has any intention of surrendering to the other. Both governments show they have considerable political stamina to keep fighting for the foreseeable future. What isn't the same, however, is the industrial capacity and the number of troops potentially available to each side. In those categories, the Russians have a distinct advantage. I mean, why is this kind of clear-eyed analysis of the stakes of the situation so absent from the political discourse around this conflict?
That puzzles me greatly. And at least among a lot of the political discourse, I can understand to a degree, because they're not steeped in military knowledge, they don't have military history, or the the training in military activities to understand how combat power is made. What I have a big problem with is a lot of these TV generals that I see, or retired American generals, that are talking the same kind of nonsense, and they have to know what I'm talking about here. And look, this is not like, hey, this is my personal opinion is that purple's the best color, and he says that no, blue's the best color. You can't prove that one way or the other. This is a practical, fundamental measurement that the industrial capacity on the Russian side, and obviously their manpower, is millions and millions more possible. And you just can see over the history of warfare, the side that has the best capacity to continue waging war almost always wins. I mean, it's virtually all the time. And the chances that Ukraine could persist over time in this environment is just so low tactically that it's just mind-boggling to me why no one wants to address, the elephant in the room on this.
Before we let you go, I want to get your take on the continuing conversations about Nord Stream, which the U.S. has signaled it's not particularly interested in having an investigation. The kind of blaming of the Russians has now shifted a little bit. The official position of the U.S. and sort of U.S. media is that, well, maybe it was some random group affiliated with Ukraine, but not the Ukrainian government and not the U.S. government. Does this continue to be, is this persuasive, or is the kind of slipping on this, making way for an eventual revelation that it might have been the Zelensky government or even the U.S. government?
Well, look, in any kind of crime, you always first go to who's the benefactor. When you're trying to find out who actually committed a crime, you find out who benefited from this. And certainly the Russians are the last one on that list because they already had full control over what flowed through the pipelines. Of course, they're not going to blow up their own pipeline and take that power out of their own hands. So you can rule them right off the bat. Then, certainly United States would benefit, so just on that alone, without any evidence or knowledge, you can say this just doesn't sound very plausible. But the way we're going about it basically is like saying, yes, someone that no one knows who it is and nothing can be proven, and we're not going to investigate, and we're going to block everything in the United Nations Security Council. Just a little suspect.
Well, Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Robby.